I'm gonna jump right in because it never feels like 90 minutes is enough when John Paul's with us. And so I don't want to eat away at the time. Many of you may remember that John Paul Lederach joined us in March for our Wednesday night Dharma talk. Many of you were there. It was kind of an optional SEBT gathering. And every time he shares with us, there's often some story or some kind of visual image that John Paul uses. And I can think of ones that you've shared with us from years ago that have just stuck with me, a kind of poetry of transmitting this peace building work that he's been doing his whole life. So many of us have already had a sense of that. We're going to dig in today to what does it mean to be a peace builder and socially engaged in that work. And just to say a few words, I always feel kind of weird talking about John Paul's bio, because for me, you really exemplify the kind of true person of no rank feel that we talk about in Zen. And if you're a person of no rank, and then we start talking about how much you've done, it's a little awkward, but you've done a lot. So just to name a few things, John Paul's a senior fellow at Humanity United and a professor emeritus at Notre Dame, and has done peace building work and conciliation work in 35 plus countries. You look at the map and you're looking at a country where John Paul's been on the ground and working with people face to face. And is this right? I just read you've written 25 books. Can that be right?
That's more or less where it's at. I write small books. If you pile them up, they equal somebody's one big book. But I'm kind of into the haiku of book writing. But
yeah. So somewhere around 25 books, and some you've, I'm sure, come across. Just a couple I want to call out are When Blood and Bones Cry Out, Journeys Through the Soundscape of Healing and Reconciliation, and The Moral Imagination, the Art and Soul of Building Peace. So this gives you a sense of where John Paul's time and mind and heart has been for his vocation and time in this work. And so with no further ado, John Paul, thank you for joining us this evening, and every evening you do. And I look forward to hearing who you have to share tonight.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Kozan and Roshi and Noah and the rest of you here. I see a lot of familiar faces, which gives me a small amount of pause because I can't remember what stories I told when over the years. So I'm going to err on the side that, telling a good story is worth rehearing it. But hopefully there'll be a few new things mixed in. And I'd like to start just with a small word of absolute gratitude to Roshi and the people that are holding this space, and to all of you, because the months of June through August were up and down for our family with my mom's passing, which came, later in the summer. She was a spectacular person and very, very caring and deeply encouraging of everything that I've ever done. Of those 25, I think she read every single word. The first few books that I wrote in English, because my repertoire has a bunch that are in Spanish that are not in English. So that's one of the reasons why you may or might not see them. She actually page edited a lot of them. And so this was a very meaningful time. She was, 88 going on 89. I had been with my dad for 70 years. So he's experiencing a deep sense of sadness. And I'm sure that he'll listen to this on the recording at some point. But I appreciated that I was able to move the date because I was coming off of some things that I just needed to give a little time to. And that flexibility was really appreciated. So thank you. When I was back and forth with Roshi on a couple of things around what might most serve at this particular moment in this overall process, she wrote a couple of words and a couple of phrases that I really picked on and made a decision around what I was going to share tonight. So those words were, tell us about your journey, the challenges and learnings that you've had in this wider field of peace building, and some of the processes and views that have been especially influential. So I'm trying something that I hope works well for all of you. I sat and thought about that for a while and have put down 5 main points, each accompanied by either a story or poetry to illustrate what it is that I'm after. And that at this particular moment, these were the 5 that stood out and the ways that I framed them in reference to what the talk this evening was about. As Kozan said, I have I consider it an enormous gift, actually. It's a luxury in some ways, that my deepest vocational passions really cross-connected at a period in history when it was possible to pursue those more professionally. What keeps me going is that vocational side, that deep sense of that this is what I was born to and into. But I have had a great opportunity to connect and do this work as a way that I could, work professionally, both in terms of being a practitioner and a scholar. And I often use those words as a dash word, but starting with the word practitioner. I really come from the standpoint of what it's like to work in very grounded ways with people that are facing enormous challenges in a lot of contexts that are rife with long histories of structural violence, that is deep injustices and exclusion, and coupling that with the fact that they've also faced long periods of open violence, armed conflict kinds of settings. So that's where my practice comes from. My scholarship side is, I think it's worth reflecting on what you've experienced. And so I write mostly in an inductive way, writing about what I have experienced and had opportunity to work on. So my first story, I don't know whether to call these point 1 and point 2, but insight 1, maybe insight 2. My insight 1 comes from the story of the very first time that I went as a younger person, in my early 30s, basically. The very first time I went down to Central America in the period of, was the decade of the 1980s, which many of you will recall was, at that time, Central America as a region had 3 open wars going on, Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. All 3 of those were multi-decade situations. Other countries in that wider region were experiencing similar things, but were not involved in an open civil war of sorts. And I was asked by a relief and development organization to look into how we might develop a capacity. So this may sound old in 2021. In the 1980s, it was not. But the idea was that there was so much being done on the side of relief and development organizations that was connected to and in settings of really deep, protracted, and often very violent conflict. Yet nobody was really focused on using the lenses of conflict and understanding it and how it works, nor the lenses of peace building. And the idea was that maybe the time had come to start really to opening that up. Much of the aid work globally was in response not just to natural disaster, but to human-made disaster in the form of warfare, displacement of people, refugee camps, you could name it. And many places had good ideas and good development initiatives, especially at community levels, totally disrupted by open conflict that was festering and going through cycles of violence. So that was part of what was emergent. And the story involves my taking time to develop some ideas and then going down and spending time with people from 5 countries who were community leaders, folks that were really deep into what was happening in local communities across the region that ran roughly from Panama to Mexico. And I made an early presentation on the idea. I was at the time coming through my own career of finishing a PhD, of working at this from the standpoint of increased efforts in mediation that I was developing. A lot of the language that I had was around what was prevalent at the time, which was how to better respond to conflict and how to engage in conflict resolution. And so I made my proposal. And what I remember from this story of sitting in a room with about 50 men and women from across the region was that after I made a little presentation on the why and the potential of the direction and the how, that would involve a multi-year process of doing engaged community-based level capacity building and working with communities about what was happening for them and developing a leadership capable of responding more to these situations. The first question that came back was this, and I'd like for you to sit with it for just a moment. For me, it started changing my whole PhD in the course of my career, to be honest. But so this, there's nothing better than the power of a really good question. But there's nothing more disconcerting when the question upends your entire paradigm. So this is that moment. And the moment of the question was this: what exactly do you mean by the word resolution? Because if what you mean is that you're going to come down here, now note the phrase, if you're going to come down here and solve our problems without changing anything, we are not interested. It's a good Zen moment to take a pause and a deep breath and go for a sit or 1500. Because it's a great question. And what it did was it shifted everything for me, because I realized in a way that I had not fully comprehended that it absolutely was possible to solve problems and not change anything. And that it absolutely was possible to be caught in a level of metaphoric orientation, which was about resolving something without getting to the deeper work of transformation. And that's when I actually shifted from that point forward, those early years in the 80s, toward the language of conflict transformation and away from the overarching paradigm being that of resolution. I still have a lot of arguments in my professional field on this, by the way, if you're interested. It's not widely accepted. Resolution is far more prevalent. But for me, what was being raised, and this is my insight one, from one good question and then a long period of great relationships in the 80s in Central America and Colombia primarily, was keep your eyes and your focus on change. What does it require? What does transformation really require? Resolution is a part of that because issues do come up. There are conflicts that require answers, that require decisions. That's a part of it. But transformation will always ask you to step back and look at the big picture of what you're really up to. What are we trying to change here? And for me, if you wanted to play this out, it's one of those books. This one is an easy one. It's called The Little Book of Conflict Transformation. I guarantee you that you can read it over breakfast. So that's about the length of it. But it captures in kind of an essential form what I have over the years understood as the transformational process. And, among other things, that it involves at least 4 very significant aspects of change. One that is the inner and the personal, that we all show up as people, and that there is and always will be an impact that conflict has on people. And that when we engage, we have to keep that in mind, that changes happen at the personal level. Changes happen, and for me, very significantly. In fact, probably if you put all of my work into one phrase, it would be that I have a relationship-centric approach to change, that relationships are affected, and those are inclusive of the relationships we have directly, but they're also inclusive of the relationships and the ways we organize systems. and how our relationships are embedded in those. And that leads us into the third area of change, which is around structural and systemic change. How does it actually happen? And then the wider and deeper and very complex one, which I won't have time to go into today, is how significant context and culture really are. And that culture impacts so much of what's going on. And that conflict often involves people engaging with deep, deep patterns that are transgenerational and have to do with deep culture. And that culture everywhere we live has aspects that are brilliant and luminous and aspects that can really create a lot of harm. So who's to judge all of that and how do we approach it? And cultural change, of course, is not easy. I think our nation here at home is facing some deep, deep questions around that, to be honest, both those structural and cultural elements. So I say that as my insight one from one good question, one small story. So never doubt the power of somebody questioning your paradigm. Always take the time to go one step deeper. And my lesson was, it really required me to keep a constant focus on change, on transformation. And that's a lot of what I've been after. That leads to an area, because coming specifically into conflict transformation, my second insight is how much is connected in what we are engaged with in this wider effort to build peace, how much is connected to the quality of relationships. And I want to come into that through several lenses. One way to understand conflict, and so one small piece of process and view that Roshi was asking for, is whatever particular conflict you may find yourself in. It could be from very interpersonal, family or community, to something more systemic, whether it's an institution or a wider set of processes that you're involved in. Conflict transformation will ask you to differentiate between the more visible content of the conflict and the relational context in which it's happening. So what happens is that a lot of energy is placed on the crisis of the moment that rises up and demands attention over something that needs to change or needs an answer. It could be a salary scale that people within an organization are arguing about. It could be, much deeper issues around equity and justice and inclusion that may be happening. But the ways that the particulars of that moment rise up is often the content of what people spend a lot of time arguing about. Below the surface, literally in the root system, because I think it's a very good metaphor, because a lot of times we talk about the roots of conflict, is the context of what I call the relational context, the relationships that are existent, both those that are more direct and those that have organizational and systemic elements to them. That, you can often, when I'm doing this with local communities, wherever I'm located, I find a plant that illustrates it, because there are a lot of plants that grow by way of what the Spanish call children. That is, they send up little shoots in different places. So you take a raspberry bush or a strawberry or a bamboo location, and it's very easy to see the existing plants. And when you actually get rid of those plants and cut them, that often only increases the capacity of the root system to send more shoots. In fact, it's kind of a strategy of agriculture with some plants. And if you have that metaphor in mind, that element of the relational context is often less explored, less understood, but is the generative context from which everything rises. And compared to a crisis issue that crops up, the ongoing nature of the relationship is continuous. So this year, this month, things can crop up. Next year, it might be a different issue, but that relational context remains similar. And it often involves issues of identity, power, and power and identity often couple into questions of inclusion and exclusion. Perceptions, because perceptions are not just what I see now, but perceptions are tied into the experience that I have had about things. So I bring into what I'm seeing and perceiving I make sense of it by way of the experience I've had. And when the experience is of sustained levels of conflict. We aren't just listening to a word, we're listening to the history of who's saying it and how it's being said and who's listening to it and who's receiving it and the reference points that it's making. So that perception interpretation element is deeply embedded in the relational context. And then, of course, most certainly there's the question of the structures of communication, and often connected to power as well. Who has access to what information? Who is aware of what's happening? Not just who participates, but who has access to the baselines of what is going on, and who has traditionally not had that, whose voices have been, in essence, muted and invisibilized over long periods of time. These are all the things that are embedded in that deeper level. And what it comes back to that I have often understood as an insight, and here I'll try to give a small story, is that much of what we do, if we're interested in the transformational process, is about shifting and changing the quality of our relationships toward greater respect, dignity, and participation, and addressing those things that have created elements of harm that are often experienced as processes that are dehumanizing. And that ultimately, the wider well-being of our community is tied often not to the particulars of the content that we may pursue, but to that ongoing quality of our relationship. So a small story. This is an odd one. I don't think any of you have heard this one. Roshi, I don't remember if I've ever told you this. But some years back at Notre Dame, some of you know that Notre Dame is a big football place. My work there took me there in the fall for about 10 years. And Wendy and I had a little tiny apartment that was right on campus, not far from where Rudy played. So on Saturdays, it's a complete disaster in the whole area. Thousands and thousands of people come into these football games. Notre Dame, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, carved off a very interesting contract with NBC Sports, and who broadcasts every Saturday all the home games, not the away games, but all the home games. That's still true till today. And as part of that contract at halftime, every Saturday halftime at home games, they run about a 2-minute blurb on national TV of something that is being highlighted across the wider University of Notre Dame's faculty, research, and students. And these are small pieces that are put together by a very sophisticated NBC team. So the proposal came up that they wanted to do a highlight of peace building, because that was a much less portrayed element on national TV, and that they wanted me to go with the team, the video production team, to one of the locations where I had been working. After much consideration, we decided that would be Colombia, and that it would be out to an area of a story I have told you all a lot about from the Association of Workers and Campesinos in the Medio Magdalena area, ATCC, where Josue Vargas had that famous statement that we're going to think for ourselves now. We're not taking your weapons, we're not taking their weapons, and we're not leaving this place. And it started a whole movement that was the very early initiation of all the peace zones, of local communities declaring that no weapons would be brought into their area, and that they would engage with every armed group across the whole of the region to negotiate respect for their local communities at considerable risk to themselves. So this was the community we decided to go to. Now, all of the friends that I have worked with for many years there have a basic fundamental understanding of their security, of their well-being. And it's this: they do not ever carry guns, ever. They believe deeply and fundamentally that the quality of their physical security is tied to the quality of relationships that they have, even with people who carry guns. So they are completely unarmed in all of the work that they do. And they've navigated for decades. They haven't, it's not that they haven't been without losses. They have on occasion had assassinations and even community massacres. It's not that it's a pure process, but they have held to that principle. They never carry guns. So when I contacted them and said that a TV crew would like to come to get a visual picture of the location and hear the story of their work around peace building, they said that would be fine. Our only condition is they just need to know we can't take them in with guns. And so I negotiated with the NBC crew and the NBC higher ups that it would work, but that we would go unarmed. There would be no armed guards that kind of protect the equipment and the people or the vehicles that were coming in. So Saturday morning on our adventure in, I come down to breakfast and I noticed that several of the hired security guards that were to accompany our trip into Medio Magdalena were carrying weapons. So I went to the head of the TV crew. Now I have to say that the story has elements to it. So one element is their equipment is expensive. NBC is super nervous about people getting kidnapped and being held for ransom because this has happened in locations. So when they provide a security crew, their image of security is well protected by way of arms. So I go to the head of the crew, Jim, he's a great guy. And I said, Jim, I just want you to know that your security crew is carrying guns. And I won't go, and none of the people that are taking us in, who are providing us the protection locally, will carry guns, and that they will not go with us if we are. Because their view is their security is tied to their relationships and their understanding, not to the weapons they carry. To his absolute credit, the head of this production crew went straight over. He happened to come out of a military background. He had been in, I believe it was Iraq. And he went straight over to the whole of the crew of the guards and said, "Are you guys packing?" And they said, "Of course we're packing. What do you think? Well, this is who we are. This is what we do. We're here. We have to protect you people." And he said, "Take them, leave them. We're not taking them. None of them. All the guns out now, or we won't go." Now you have to imagine this was a huge potential economic disaster on all fronts. By the time you get a crew down to Colombia, and by the time you get to that location, and so the entire crew of armed guards left all their weapons, and off we went. Now, this is a small story. If you ever want to see the clip, you can find the clip in Notre Dame's halftime archives. I don't know what it's called, but there's a link to it somewhere. The story behind the story is, what a lesson. That there are people in this world who actually believe that the quality of our collective security is tied to the quality of our relationships, not to the quantity or size of our guns. Imagine that lesson everywhere. And what this world would be if we understood the absolute truth, the veracity of that, and that it came not from people who would have emerged from, say, a long-standing pacifist tradition, but from people who learned it because they understood that their lives were better if they could develop that quality of relationship, even with people who were their enemies. So remember this, when you're working on these situations, what you're ultimately trying to get to is, what is the nature of the quality of relationships that people have and that we have? And how do we open that up when it's tough? And that's long, slow work quite often. Third insight, I'm cognizant of my time because my stories get away from me, but I'm going to keep telling them, so just hang on a bit. Third insight, similar to the things that I've been describing, I have often worked in situations that have long histories of deep and protracted conflict. And what I've learned is, and I'm going to try to put it in the simplest of phrases, start small but grow boundless. Start small, but grow boundless. Now, by boundless, I mean that it can imagine itself as a much greater and wider ripple that you won't fully know. But don't start with the wide ripple. Start small. I actually have shared, I think before, a small story I'm going to repeat today, if I have for some of you, about how significant the learning was from the women of Wajir district in Kenya, which touches on the border with Somalia. I often refer to this story in the moral imagination. I think it's titled The Story of 5 Women Who Stopped a War. And Deka Ibrahim, who was a very dear friend, who's no longer with us now, was instrumental in starting much of that process, along with several other women, tells the story of how they started, that it came at the time and around the event of a wedding that they had participated in. And when they were coming back from the wedding, the sub-clan, inter-clan armed conflict exploded in Wajir town, which is right on the border with Somalis. These are all Somali ethnic background, but they're one ethnic group that's subdivided primarily into sub-clans. And it's the sub-clans that are fighting. And they're often younger people. They have very sophisticated weaponry. They're often riding on the back of Jeeps that have these large machine guns attached to them. And a fight broke out between 2 groups in 2 parts of the town. And the women coming back from the wedding found themselves scrambling. In fact, Deka says, I grabbed my daughter, Kaltuma, who, by the way, her daughter, I was just on a recent intergenerational conversation. And it's sort of spectacular. Well, I'm going to get emotional tonight. I apologize, but it is absolutely spectacular when you think about these people and the quality of what they bring. But she grabbed her daughter, she ran to her house, she got underneath the bed while bullets came in and out of the house in the neighborhood explosion of these 2 sub-clans fighting it out. And while she was laying there holding her daughter, she said, I had such a distinct memory of having been under that same bed with my mother as a child, under the same conditions. And I said to myself, this is Deka speaking, I said to myself, this absolutely has got to stop. Remember that. It's always good to start with people who say this has got to stop. Next morning, she goes out. 5 or 6 of the women who had a very similar experience started to gather. They had a phrase, and there's a little movie about the Wajir women, if you ever want to see it, that you can find on Google. Just Google Wajir women and you'll locate it. You'll even see Deka in the movie. These 5 or 6 women gathered, and the phrase that they used over and again, and I heard them say it so many times, was we just sat together to see what we knew. That's the starting point. You don't need hundreds. You need 5 or 6, but very good in their reference point. The Somali women had a certain advantage, and that it was that marriages in Somalia are always cross-clan. So when you marry across a clan and the clans get into a fight, it means that your father and your brothers are fighting your husband and your sons. I'm just talking the actual experience of many women. So the women, anthropologically speaking, in reference to how they culturally engage in peace building, it is often women who are the forerunner ambassadors, because they are among those who can travel from their clan of marriage to their clan of origin and back, historically more safely. As time has progressed and weapons have gotten sophisticated and culture has collapsed, this becomes more dangerous. But when those women sat, they actually were from a half dozen different connections into the sub-clan mix that was happening in their region. And they all, between them, had connections. And pretty much what they started doing was asking a very simple question, not only what we know, but who we know. And they began a process of moving out and talking to people where whichever 2 or 3 women had the connection into that particular group, they would go, and the others would go the other way. It's that notion of the, I'll come back to, of circulation. And they began to convene. They first decided just to do it as women. Let's get more women into this, and let's start by doing one thing. And the one thing was, we think we can make a difference at the local market. The local market has become too dangerous. Weapons are sold there, guns are sold there, and people that are coming from different subclans are sometimes discriminated against as to whether they can buy or sell. So as women, let's set up a whole process where we guard without weapons, we guard the market and make it safe for anyone from any subclan to buy and sell. That was where they started. Now, I don't have time to go into the iterations of the levels that went through reaching out to elders, religious leaders, getting the clan elders on board, where they mobilized around traditional approaches. The question of who's carrying the guns turned out to be their own kids, their own nephews. They set up a traveling set of people that went out to seek ways of disarming youth militias, where they would go into the bush and find extended family members, into businessmen, because people don't give up guns if they don't have a job. A gun is a job in a lot of places. So how are you going to give up a gun if somebody's not getting the businessman? What employment are we going to have? Into the police, into the military, into the parliament, into the national level. This crew just kept going. So I say, they were such an example of start small and grow boundless, one step at a time. And I think there's a real lesson in this in many regards, because, and I refer to this in The Moral Imagination, if you want to go to that book, I refer to this as the critical yeast instead of the critical mass. So we know about the critical mass. It's out of physics, but when sociologists started applying it to social settings, we made a mistake. I'll be very honest, because the image of critical mass is of a lot of people. And when people ask, is there a critical mass emerging in the streets over X issue, they're always counting the number of people. But critical mass in physics actually isn't that at all. In physics, critical mass is the smallest unit that has potential of replicating itself indefinitely. That's the whole notion of nuclear energy. It's when there is a certain quality of interaction of the atomic structure that it creates a reaction that is capable of regenerating itself. And that point is the critical mass. So what you need to ask is, in the critical yeast, I shifted metaphors because, as you know, the smallest ingredient in bread baking is the yeast. So if you think critical mass in bread, you would say you put all the flour in there, you get everything in, but that little small ingredient, and it has to be protected in a certain way as it begins to grow, and it has to be tested and pushed down. I mean, the metaphor is actually a very good one, but it is the ingredient that has a capability of making everything else grow. But it depends on the quality, not the quantity of those relationships. And that quality points to finding a mixed group that's willing to mix. And that's kind of leads to a fourth insight. So my third one would be start small and grow boundless. And I think, if I say one small notion about that, it really has a lot to do with the courage to reach across divides, to be in relationship over time with people who can be quite different. I think a lot of our social movements, especially around peace movements, have often made the mistake that our primary strategy for change is to grow the movement of like-minded. And so what we orient ourselves toward is usually finding something that everyone's opposed to, but not things that we're trying to build. And so the movements collapse as soon as there is a shift on a particular thing that may be there. This is actually the opposite. It is, when I say willing to be in a mixed group and willing to mix, I'm referring to something that's more akin to highly unlikely friendships, to being in what in Colombia we call improbable dialogues. It is the strategy of holding together small units of the not like-minded and finding a way to open up the differences while holding to the relationship and asking, what can we do? And what direction can it go? And out of smallness can come enormous ripple if the quality of what is being brought together has that kind of capacity and reach. So it involves that courage to reach. It often involves, I think, the courage to circulate. You have to be able to go out and see the world from the porches and lives of people who live where they live. Now, I know that's hard in COVID, but it deeply is a part of what I've seen happening over and again when small grows, is that people use circulation more than convening. You're not inviting people to your space. You're going out and trying to understand how the world is seen and felt from their spaces, or what we might call a form of collective empathy. Collective empathy, I think, is the ability to understand not just how it looks now, but the stories that are placed and experienced based, how the world is seen from the experience that people have lived. And when that's done in a way that is circulating around the complexity of a situation, it begins to thread. This was what I was talking last time, I think in March, about the spider web. It's very much that kind of a web approach to those relationships. But this is core to most everything I've seen, where it starts small and grows boundless. Fourth insight. Here I'd like to read a poem. It takes me back to another part of Colombia in a very specific moment, and it's titled Backseat Taxi. Backseat Taxi. It's not a haiku, but I have some haikus coming. This one's not. Backseat Taxi. Context was we just finished a multi-day gathering around people that were working locally in highly armed situations, around their ability to think through these strategies of peace building. I had a ride from that location to another town, and one of the people who participated in those 3 or 4 days was quite a lively young woman, was sharing the ride with me. So this is Backseat Taxi. Where are you headed tonight? I ask. Home to my teaching. Oh, me too. What age do you teach? Well, after university, I went back to teach the younger ones, she said. I like working with kids. Oh, yeah? Where? Just south of Bucaramanga. Oh, I was through there a few years back. A little town called San Jose de Miranda left a huge impression on me. Wow, Miranda, that is really close to my village. Is Padre Rafa still there? Oh, my, yes, still there. San Jose de Miranda. Never felt more overwhelmed. Sitting with those widows and orphans. One story haunts me. This young campesina woman who watched her husband take bullet after bullet, and then they used his head for a soccer game while her children watched. Oh, that was my hometown. My father was killed that day. Silence held us like the last note of a lullaby. Father Rafa was so helpful. He pulled us through. It was why I went back to teach. I love teaching. I love the kids. Backseat Taxi. Father Rafa was a friend who I came to know. And I remember going for a chapter that I was writing to talk to him about how he proceeded, how he was able to go out in the community where he lived and meet these people who were engaged in these kinds of violent activities. And there was a phrase that I quoted in that chapter that I've never forgotten from Father Rafa. Because he said, well, you know, one of the things that I've learned is this. When I'm facing the end of a gun pointed at my face, I always look past it, straight into the eyes of the person holding it. And then I say to myself every time, remember, you have a person before you. Remember, you have a person before you. Well, I have certainly studied and certainly written about a lot of approaches and strategies for peace building. After 45 years, I've come to one conclusion. The quality of your presence is going to matter more than any technical expertise you have. And the question is, how are you going to cultivate it? And I think that involves a process of rehumanization. I think conflict subtly and openly dehumanizes all of us so often. And what people most are searching for is for somebody to see them. For me, that quality of presence requires a lot of inner work, the kind that I think we all engage in. There may be different strategies that we have for what works best for us, but your moments will come when you're facing those kind of challenges, because in conflict, people are not at their best. And when you're challenged personally, you're not at your best. But what's going to shift a lot of things, going back to my word change, it's going to transform things. A big part of it is what kind of quality of presence we bring to this in the ways that we interact with other people, even those we fear, certainly those we don't understand, and certainly those that we may perceive as not only wrong-headed, but enemies. I've had to face quite a few people that I would consider engaged in behavior I can believe is completely evil. And I remember Father Rafa's words, you know, remember you have a person before you. Fourth insight. Last one. The last one is pretty short. And it's kind of paradoxical to say that it's short because the title of it is The Journey's Long. And what I attach to the journey's long are three other phrases. The journey's long, so remember to take one step. The journey's urgent, so remember to slow down. The journey is fraught, so give your soul some love. Basically, committing into this work, I think, is more of a lifelong journey than a project. Not always easy to convince philanthropies of that, but that's the nature of it. And I think you have to prepare and care for yourself. So I'm going to conclude with two little pieces that I'd like to read to you, which are haiku based, because haiku is a daily practice that I have. It's one of the ways that I engage in mindfulness. Every morning, usually, sometimes other parts of the day, but usually it's every morning early. And it permits me to interact with whatever's happening on the walk that morning. So many of these are nature-based. It's amazing wherever you live, how you can engage in a form of micro-tourism. Just walking the same path, but every day something new. Every day something that incites your own senses, because that's the nature of what we live in. These are actually two that are part of a collection that I'm curating. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it. When my mom became ill, and I couldn't initially reach her, I started sending her every day by way of our iPhones a photo of where I was walking that day of one thing, and a haiku or a short poem around that photo. And from when I started that to when she passed was about 30 days. And then after she passed, I decided to keep it up. So for the next 30 days, I did the same thing. And it's now 60 poems. So it's a small volume. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. So if any of you say you're interested, maybe I'll just send it. This would be a nice community to just read it. I'm going to read you two from the 6th day after my mom passed, back home here in Colorado, and the 24th day. Those were the two I chose to read to you. And I'm sharing these because maybe they have some small insight into what we've talked about, but I'm also sharing them to tell you preparing yourself is daily. It's practice. It's giving care to your soul even when it doesn't feel like you got anything left to care for. So 6th day, this is, sometimes it comes this way, haikus come in batches. So this is 6 haikus in sequence. 1, below glassy pond, a patient depth slowly opens. Nothing but darkness. 2, light fades falling short. Mountains disappear. Only vastness closes in. 3, it is here I sit, waiting on the unknown gift brokenness offers. 4, darkness asks nothing, yet she holds everything, a tender safety. 5, why worry just yet about light when infinite drift surrounds your soul? 6, hope freed, never more alive than when held in this unending vastness. And day 24, after her passing, where I live, some miles from us, I-70 comes through. And there's mountains and forests that separate us. But interestingly, the sounds of I-70 seem to traverse space. Some of you may have had this experience on occasion. 24. In the far distance, a truck pulls up the highway. Forest breathes it in. Remaining steadfast while the world sparks, spews, and spins. Silent rootedness. Thank you very much for your patience. I've kind of rambled past my time.
Not at all, John. Thank you. We have another 30 minutes for Q&A, and usually we just allow people to step in and ask questions. And I wonder if there's any way you want to structure it that works best for you.
No, I'm happy to take them. I can get to rambling on answers, so maybe it's helpful to take a couple.
Take a
but
couple.
I get whatever suits and serves you all best is fine.
Wonderful. So if anyone wants to ask questions of John Paul, just raise your digital hand. maybe we'll take a couple here at the beginning or a few. And while people are finding their digital hand, I'll add to the list, John Paul, a question I have, which is just if there's any more you could say about the quality of relationships, what you mean by quality. I love the way you said it, relationships that are kind of odd couples, people with different perspectives and different points of view coming together. I wonder what else is important there in terms of the quality of relationships. So Marina, I'm gonna unmute you. Go ahead.
Wonderful, thank you. What a pleasure to be with you and to hear from you. And I'm just my condolences about the loss of your mother. So that's very heartfelt.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I too come from the field of international development or international assistance over many years, and have grappled with, I'm the one I put in the chat about being a sort of an outside helper, coming into communities that we're seeking to support in some way. And I'm just so curious to hear from you, from all your vast experience, when you leave a community and you think about your added value to the conflict transformation in that particular community. I'm curious about, how do you measure your personal success? I did hear you interviewed, I think it was with Krista Tippett. You said once you wrote a donor report in haiku.
Yes, I did.
So let's take a couple more and then we'll let John Paul respond, and then maybe a couple more after that. Does that work?
Well, Kozan, I'd love to hear John Paul's response to Marina's question.
Okay, so we'll do a question by question.
Okay, well, I'll try to tie these two in because they have an element to it. So one of the things that I found over time was that I think all of us have different gifts that we bring in different ways that we may find ourselves drawn into and able to work with situations and initiatives. So what I'm sharing is my own personal one. I have great respect for a wide range of people that may operate and make different choices, because I think we need them. Complexity suggests that we need a lot of different things that at least have some element of awareness and connection, and not narrow it to a single thing. My experience was this, that at a certain point in my life, I had to make a decision that the very nature of what I was doing required me to stay with it longer than most of what the external agencies and programs were typically willing to do. And I made a commitment at a certain point where I said I would take on no new initiatives unless the people that I was working with were willing to commit to a minimum of a decade, and often more. Colombia, I've worked in since 1988. I still work absolutely the closest with a small set of people that I first initiated it with, all these years later. Now, the reason I say that is it has something to do both with your question of quality of relationship and success, I think. So what I found was that I had to move in the direction of working with fewer things deeper and longer, and not getting too spread across many things, though I still keep, similar to tonight, I keep an open door to opportunities to share things more widely. But I know where my deeper priority and commitment is. And when that pertains to that kind of work, it means that the quality of relationship has a couple of characteristics, especially in settings where you're trying to build toward an initiative, constantly asking the question, similar to the women of Wajir, who's missing? What's missing? And expanding out to those where even people that may be involved in it are nervous about it. It's dangerous. It's hard to reach in certain directions in those settings. So finding ways to ask that question takes time. if you understood the three levels of victims in conflicts, they're these. The first victim of war, we've all heard, is truth. I think the first victim of conflict is trust. And I think the victim of toxic polarization is curiosity. So part of the quality of relationships, which connects to the quality of presence, is how to remain open to that which is unknown and that which is very different, and may in fact be threatening to the very people and things you care about. Those require, in settings that are dangerous, time.
Yeah.
It will take time to get there. It doesn't happen overnight. And it often happens by way of people who have existing but sort of invisibilized connections of trust. So you're building this little web. The key qualities for me, to come back to that part of it, of which I think pertain to the measures of success in many regards, is not just to how to stay open and curious, but to ask about people's life stories. What's really happened in their life that's brought them to where they're at? To take time for that. Second quality is dignity is basically a form of deep respect. And I think that we bring dignity to the degree that we reduce our reactivity and increase our capacity to truly respect. I've often said, and you probably heard me say it, that the Latin root of the word respect is really interesting because it's spacere. In Latin, it's the same. The word respect shares a common etymology with the word spectator, just as an example. So it's about, spacere is to watch. To respecere, to respect, is to turn and look again. Now, I think that part of the process of quality of relationship is that it's about people who are willing to commit to holding together in spite of deep difference and even sometimes falling out, but you come back. It's that ability to turn and come back, turn and come back. And I think the places where those qualities begin to merge, where people have an ability to come together across deep difference, is actually the motor of what makes a lot of other things possible, even though it starts small. And so for me, it's combinations of commitment to time, honesty. My big lesson in life is this: people much prefer authenticity and honesty over saying the right things. I'm not trying to make a comment on political correctness or anything else. I'm just telling you what I know, that in conflict, people just don't want bullshit. So even if you disagree with them, they prefer you being honest. Even if you say things wrong and it hurts, they prefer an honest set of things that stays together than trying to make it all right and appeasing without being honest. And I sometimes think that we view our, a lot of people view this work as holding back on who I am. Well, I think you hold back on reacting and being weird and, going off on your scene, whatever it is, that you can hold back on, but don't hold back on sharing who you really are. Because that's what makes a relationship authentic. It's what holds, it's the glue. So how to hold, honesty and difference and do it over time. That's what I mean by quality of relationship, that there is a commitment. And, I don't live in all these places for 10 years straight through, but, the people I worked with in Nepal, I made 50, I think it was close to 60 trips out to the places that we worked with. And now those folks are up and running and doing stuff that is far beyond my imagination. And, they'll call whenever they need it, but it's the question of how, what kind of time, and I couldn't have done that if I was doing it in even 4 places. You have to make a decision about where, that was my view. I had to make a decision about where I was going to prioritize. Now, I do believe in seed planting, and there's a real role around, spreading seed. But for me, it became really critical that change does not happen quickly. And it's going to need unusual people coming together, and that's going to take time to curate and hold. And it's going to take ups and downs, and you're going to have to stick with it. So those are, I think I'm getting at those good. Now, measures of success, I think measure of success for me is much less about the outputs and outcomes in the ways that they're traditionally defined. It's much more about the quality of the kind of relationships that we've developed and the capacities that people have to be more fully themselves and to innovate and generate ideas independent of the external components that may be accompanying parts of it. And for me, that's when I look at that systemically, I think the key is whether in the course of work, you have left a small nudge that's capable of regenerating good independent of you. And if that's happened, I consider it a success. And where it doesn't happen, I have things to learn, deep learning. So you never stop learning. I much prefer evaluation as learning than evaluation as measurement, success and failure. Okay, that's very good. Maybe Roshi, you wanted to say something about that. Please do.
Only to Kozan, I realized that you wanted to take many questions, so I apologize. So Kozan, I'm sorry, I
Not at
missed
all.
that piece.
Not at all.
Yeah, but I think considering.
You've muted.
Considering how rich this is, multiple questions that John Paul can synthesize is a really good idea.
John Paul, should we take a couple more?
Yeah, I actually see 4 hands. Why don't we just go across?
Should we take all 4?
If
Great.
they converge, and if not, I'll invent a way to haiku them.
You'll find a way through. I love it. All right, well, I'll just go through as they are on my screen. So Janie, if you want to start off.
I was just wondering, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I was just wondering if I wanted to ask John Paul if he's done any work on this country with the polarization and has any suggestions or thoughts about that.
Great question. I had the same one, and I'd written down the victim of polarization is curiosity. Appreciated that tidbit already, John Paul. Nancy, go ahead.
You stress the quality of presence, and of course that makes complete sense to me. But I'm wondering, what are the elements that you think are important? You kind of touched on it, but the elements in the quality of presence, but also how your presence has been changed or by the experiences and that you've had over time.
Thanks, Nancy. Henry.
Thank you for that excellent talk. I couldn't help but be reminded of something I had read many times as an interested person in national politics long before it became war, that Congress people used to get together in Washington, cross party lines, and have dinners, go to each other's homes, have parties. And in recent years, that has totally disappeared. And with it has disappeared the comedy, which I say that COMITY, which has led to the disaster we've got in politics now.
Thank you, Henry. And Cheryl.
John Paul, thank you so much for this talk. It's very deeply felt, as I'm in the weeks where I teach civil liberties and civil rights to my students, and I've been taking copious notes. Would you address for me, please, what you suggest is a good way to get young adults to really think about the quality of relationships and working through our society's structural racism?
Thank you, Cheryl.
Those were the 4, right, Kozan?
Those are the four.
Okay, they're great.
Softballs.
Yeah, softball, that's great. So we got a PhD dissertation on each one. It's fantastic. Um, there's sort of a connection between polarization and what Henry said. So I'll maybe just add, in fact, across a number of these, we could go ways of illustrating it. I wouldn't have time this evening to jump in completely to the polarization thing. I was on last night, for example, with around 100 journalists in Colombia on the dynamics of polarization, because they're coming into an election period similar to us, but they're coming out of 50 years of war that got contested. You can imagine that the narrow margin of victory that we have in presidential, imagine voting whether you want to end a 50-year war or not, and this country vote is split by 0.2%. And the no wins, which is, it's kind of phenomenal when you think about it. But anyway, so polarization, let me make a small remark that I would be, first of all, very happy if you so are inclined to invite me back at some point to take this on directly with you all. There actually is I did a systems map of polarization that capture the main social science findings around how intensification of conflict leads into toxic polarization and violence, and what some of the dynamic systems, of course, always looks at dynamics, not events or particular issues. And so that has to do with the dynamics of in-out groups, the dynamics of increased, the structures of not having direct communication, eventually into ways in which it creates demonization. There are elements that are sometimes called perceptive polarization, which is the process by which at some point people add greater extremism to the views of others than they actually have, but they behave in response to that greater extremism, which then incites a kind of living into it in reaction to what people are experiencing on the other side, that creates a kind of a repeated loop that can be very dangerous. What Henry said is very close to, for example, Peter Coleman's book that recently came out, which is an excellent book on this. He talks very specifically about this, Henry, in reference to he pinpoints the time period of that. And the time period, I'm not going at this in terms of partisan politics, so forgive me if I err. I'll beg forgiveness before I sin here. But it came at the time period of Newt Gingrich, where the strategy was go home over weekends, do not stay and consort. Washington is the problem. Now, we may all have a sense or a feeling that Washington gets disattached from the local communities, and there is a need for representatives to be in regular communication. But when that became not just a kind of a mandate, it became a mandate that eliminated all the ways in which friendships and in the very thing that I was talking about, were systematically taken away until the point where within polarization, the ultimate demands of in-group, out-group are that you move toward a single narrative. It becomes harder and harder to have internal disagreement. Internal cohesion is increased by external threat. So the more that you can create fear about external threat, the greater the internal cohesion. That in periods of intensification, more extremist leadership rises to greater prominence and moderates descend, and there is increased pressure to define yourself on one side or another. Those are all, we could kind of look at them in more carefully, but those are dynamics. So when you eliminate the spaces of friendship that cuts across difference, you eliminate the threads that hold polarization to normal levels instead of toxic levels. And toxicity, once it becomes frozen in the system, has myriad ways of repeating that, and often places us into patterns of not just experiencing enmity, but experiencing forms of demonization, and ultimately win all or lose all and survival. And violence at different points comes into that, but a lot of places I work, that whole system is in place, plus sustained, open, armed violence for decades. So it then becomes all the more difficult to work your way back. So in reference to your question about US, yeah, there are a couple of blogs that I've been a part of recently that spoke to this. If you're interested, I'll try to locate them and send them through. One of them was in, a period ahead of our election about the challenges of polarization and the precipice of violence that we're facing in a lot of ways. This would have preceded the events that we saw more recently. We are working, Humanity United has developed now a peace building agenda that we're working very diligently on, starting with the communities where our offices are located, most significantly Washington, DC. So I work very closely with the people who are embedded in the 8th Ward of Washington, DC, which is one of the poorest and highest levels of violence and COVID of any place in the country. And those, really place you into a pretty careful look at a lot of things. I have historically been proximate to some of the big issues on discrimination and racism, particularly working closely with a number of indigenous communities around their traditional and wisdom practices of peace building, from folks that are embedded within the Dene Navajo Nation, the Mohawk uprising some years ago in 1990. I was very deeply involved in some aspects of that. So it's a little long to go through it all, but yeah, I think there is an extraordinary need to always include us in the international community. We often think about international work as being something that we go out to do good in. And I think that mindset has to get radically shifted. And the question that was being asked in particular about young adults and quality of relationship and issues of structural, Cheryl, I think, was asking that. Sounds like you might be embedded in a university or college community. I've taken on, so in reference to that, one of the things I've been doing quite consistently over the last years was talking very directly to young people about what an extraordinary laboratory universities are, campuses are. Virtually in any campus in the US, you're going to have access to every species of humankind you want to locate, every kind and variety. And so do the big, small thing. It's kind of what I call it. Do the big, small thing. Kind of look around and figure out one or two people who are completely different than you. I mean, you probably have come from a community where you've been maybe a little more insulated. You've been in a setting where you're probably more proximate to some set of people. You're declaring a major, which is going to put you in, a certain set of people. Look around and take advantage that you've got, a potential zoological experiment right in your home area. Pick one or two people. So this is my basic appeal. I call it how weird friends change the world. I made a talk on it, and maybe you've made it at Upaya a while back, but how weird friends change the world. Pick one or two people. It may take you a while that they give you enough trust they're willing to do it, but try to figure out a way to go to coffee with them, or tea, or a weekend beer, whatever your mode of drinking is. I think table and drinking is kind of a good thing. So do a tea or a coffee, and see if you can figure out a way that you do that, say once a week or once every 2 weeks. And then I throw in the kicker: for the rest of your life. In other words, if you're looking out across to find somebody who may think different, don't think politically about locating the adversary. I'm actually asking that the big, small thing is to commit to friendship, but to do it with people that are unexpectedly different, and to take time so that, if you do coffee for the rest of your life once a month or once a week, metaphorically speaking, you're not talking about arguing over who's right or wrong. You're going to have to sort out how you're going to be friends, in spite of whatever life things have been thrown at you that make you different. And I think that little thing is where the really big things start. Like, okay, so now I'm sitting down with my friend Tidra who grew up in the far Southeast and is now my co-partner in how we're working at this at Humanity United. And I'm saying, how did you grow up? What was it like? You know, and how did you get to the place where you, and it, you know, let's be clear that honesty unveils itself as trust rises. And it takes some onion peeling to get to the place where you can say things that you may find difficult or you're afraid to actually say. But you want to get to a place where the coffee drinking permits you to become naked. I'm metaphorically speaking, obviously, here. I mean, I'm sure that some of these may lead to relationships. What I'm after is this, that you get to the point where you could say something that just comes out and it's as honest as the day is long, but maybe it was said wrongly and it actually hurt somebody. And you would never have said it because you want to not be that person who is racist or not be that person who's discriminatory. And so you're actually hiding from yourself pieces that are part of you. What you want in that coffee location is the quality that you can be honest and stay together. That's what I'm after with these college kids. Now, why not do it when you have an extraordinary opportunity like you've never had in your life on a college campus? Now, COVID messes this strategy up a bit, but it'll come back. But that's what I'm after, because I think to unpeel the nature of the systemic, we have to simultaneously unpeel the inner and the relational. That was a talk I gave at Upaya. If you want to go back and find that, it was one of my better ones. And someday I hope it gets into a book, Roshi, where it was basically making a case that this work is about the inner, the relational, and the systemic. And you don't get to all three of those in the abstract. You've got to get to them embodied. And that embodiment, I think, is about conversation. And you have to remember that conversation in its Latin root is similar to respect in that it's converse, with the turn. So conversation in and of itself is about turning to be with. And I think that if we can create even small pockets that has that kind of boundless quality to it, a lot of interesting stuff can happen. I rambled a bit there, sorry. I forgot the question of how I've changed in quality of presence in the elements, because it's a great question. You know, over the years, I think there's a lot of things you learn when you work proximate to human suffering and proximate to a lot of conflict. And one of the things that I learned was the patience that it takes, that my task is not answers. And that sitting in a deep mystery of the unknown is good and okay, and admit it. Asking to hear more on stuff I don't understand, instead of assuming I know what was said and trying to react to it. Those were all things that little by little led to, I think, a better ability to, so the way to say it is this, to work on the process of being less anxious in the presence of things that you find threatening. And that I would call, and people in family systems theory call, a non-anxious presence. But I don't think it's easily cultivated. It's something you have to work toward. There are little pieces that can help, like, can you say more about it? Is a great way to just continue a piece of something that you don't understand. Learning to know your own signals of reactivity. It's a big one for me, so I can give you mine. When I hear myself getting defensive, which happens more than I care to think about sometimes, when I hear myself getting defensive, I know that what has triggered it is my own insecurity. So rather than moving towards certainty that I'm absolutely right, which I think actually the big challenge in our country is not misinformation, it's the absolute lock into certainty that people won't move away from. It's the lack of curiosity that's our problem, not, you know, floating misinformation. I know it's a big issue, but that, to me, it's that. So when I'm defensive, I know that it comes from my insecurity. And that's not about the content of what we're referring to, nor the quality of the person that's in front of me. It's an inner agenda that I have, that I've got to give some time to. And if I can recognize it early enough, I can become more patient with it. And that's part of what I've worked on over the years. I recognize, I'll give you an example. I've got great friends that I work with on the South Sudan Initiative. We're working with a youth movement. So most of the people that I actually work with, even on my team at HU, are a lot younger than I am. They're quite young. And on a number of sessions, because I have somewhat limited travel these days, because of my wife, Wendy's been about 14 years into Parkinson's. So we just are on a little different pace around a lot of stuff. I will zoom into a gathering and spend some time with listening to people and giving support to the facilitators, et cetera. Some of the younger folks, when they come into it, they'll come, I remember very distinctly one of them coming out and say, man, stuff just blew up. I don't know if this thing's going to hold together. And I'm sitting, across Zoom, and she'll look at me and say, why are you smiling? And I said, my answer, I can remember very clear. I said, oh, Zoe, there couldn't be anything better than people getting to an honest blow up. Yeah, that means an onion is getting peeled. Hang in there. Give some time, stay with it. Learning to live with ambiguity and learning to appreciate anger are big parts, I think, of quality of presence. Learning when you add to or when you help stabilize the level of reactivity. It's not just that you're doing that as an individual in an interpersonal relationship. It is that as any one individual or relationship raises its capacity to handle fear and anxiety more constructively, the whole of the system can float a little higher. And when it disappears, the whole of the system descends and goes back to that pattern. And so to see it in yourself and know your own, and to learn to work on the cutting edges of what you're comfortable with and what you're not, can be a part of where your gifts are, but also can be a part of every one of our personal journeys, in reference to expanding and deepening those capacities. Okay, that was what. Thank you. I'm not sure where we're at, Kozan, with time here.
We're getting close.
Okay.
We're getting close, John Paul. Perfect timing, actually, with those 4 questions. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I don't know if you've read, people have been sharing in chats their reflections and the hope that you bring in the way you talk about these difficult subjects, these subjects of conflict and life and death, and the constancy and the poetry. So thank you for bringing all of that, for your presence.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't see the chat, so if you could copy and send them to me, I'd love to see them at some point.
I will. I will do that right now. And Roshi, I wonder if you want to say a few words before we close.
I'm just filled with such gratitude. And I know your expression of the long peace is something that has really stayed with me. I'm reflecting on something Joe Campbell said, jumping from wave to wave in search of wetness. And you're someone who just dives down into the depths, and you're able to be in that darkness as a light, and to have almost 40 years in the peace building process in Colombia, and not to abandon that process, even when the treaty was finally signed and then fell apart.
Yeah.
And you persist. And that patience, I feel, is an example to all of us, as well as the weird friend example. I hope all of us will continue to build weird friendships across so-called lines of difference, and to bring this curiosity that is just to me, the sort of secret ingredient in the work
absolutely.
that we do as socially engaged practitioners. So
Yeah.
thank you with all my heart.
Thank you. And thank you, Roshi, and to all of you, really for what you're doing.
Thank you,
Hope to
John
see you
Paul.
again.
And just to say, I'll follow up if there are any blogs you have to offer this community on the issue of polarization, which I know is on all of our minds. And if Roshi and I can take you up on returning and talking about that
Yes.
topic, we would love to. So we'll
Yeah,
be in
I'd be happy to. We could walk through the systems map and just see what you think.
Yeah.
We need it.
Yeah.
And your generosity in terms of your incredible service for decades is just extraordinary. So
Yeah.
love to you
Thank
and
you.
to all our good common friends, by the
Yeah.
way.
Absolutely.
They're weird.
They're good, weird friends.
Yeah. But, thank Buddha for them and you,
Yeah.
dear friend.
Very good.
Love to
Thank
Wendy.
you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, John Paul. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We'll see you all in a week.